This morning we're going to be looking at attention to detail, because God brings about details that we have to pay attention to. If God is not interested in the details that He gives, then why would He ever give them? If He's not interested, such as on Wednesday nights in the classroom for the children, we have been talking about Noah and building the ark and the flood. And God gives Noah a lot of information, a lot of detail concerning the ark and how it's to be constructed. And if God was not concerned about how it was to be constructed, then why does He give those details? He gives its dimensions of width, length, height. He gives that. He tells where the door and the window are to be. He tells of what the wood is to be. It's not to be just any material. It's to be a specific wood. It's to have pitch on the inside and the outside of the hull. How many decks or how many floors it has. That there are to be rooms in there. There's to be storage of food, and they're going to have to gather up that food and begin to store that up. There's all these details that have been given, and if God was not interested in the details, He would not have given those details. If He did not care how big the ark may have been, then He would have given no dimension whatsoever. But He does give the dimension, and we see at the end of the building of the ark that Noah did everything God told him to do. He did it all. So it was the correct wood, it was the correct dimensions, height, width, length. It was with one door and one window, the door set up on the side of the ark, the window 1 cubit from the top of the ark. All these things were put into action as God gave those details. And we can read concerning Noah in Genesis chapter 6 and him putting all those things together and realize and understand just universally that God gave these details expecting Noah to perform them. But when we look at details that God intends on us, some folks, they're going to see in a different way. While they can see details given to others and others need to pay attention to it, well, God has not given us any details whatsoever? God has given us no information whatsoever? No, He has given us details, but with some folks, it's as though it doesn't matter. It's as though we'll do what we want to do anyway. Is that going to be pleasing to God? Well, if it is, I'd like to know how it is, because it's not. Can God be served through any action? Any action? Can God be served through any action? Whether it's remotely good or horribly evil, can He be served by it? And I think the answer to that is no. He's not going to be served by any action. Can God be worshiped by any action? And that, once again, something remotely good that perhaps we've made up, or horribly evil. Can both of those things be okay for worship to God? Can that be? Because He's told us how He wants to be worshiped. And He's given details in that. And we're going to see later in this lesson just one facet of that. Now we go to John 4 and verse 22. And here we have these words, Spirit and truth. God is Spirit. And those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. Jesus is saying this to a Samaritan woman. Now the Samaritans considered themselves Jewish, but the Jews did not consider the Samaritans Jewish. Not by their heritage, not by their ancestry, because their ancestry was mixed and confused, and they could not be part of things like concerning the temple because they could not be considered Jewish. It's nothing that the Samaritans did on that part. They can't help how they were born, who they were born to. They can't help that. But here's something they could help is, they were trying to worship God under the law of Moses, but not accepting anything beyond the writings of Moses. So they would reject the rest of the Old Testament. While one had to have the books of Moses, that is correct, one also needs to accept the rest of the prophets. Prophets such as David, who they would have rejected. Prophets such as Joshua, who they would have rejected that book that would have come immediately after Deuteronomy. They would have rejected Isaiah, who prophesies concerning the Christ. Now, so did Moses, and so the Samaritans did know there was going to be a Messiah. They did know that. Simply because, and they recognized that simply because Moses spoke of it as well. But here Jesus tells her, God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. So let's talk about spirit for just a moment. Spirit is going to be with the proper attitude, the proper motive, the proper intent. You cannot worship God without intending to worship God. It's not done accidentally. It's not done just by happenstance. You cannot worship God without the intent to do it. All right, let me give you an example. It's the same way with any kind of worship. Okay, any kind of worship. I've been in places where there are idols in those places. Matter of fact, I've gone to restaurants where right there at the front of the restaurant there is an idol. Okay, do I go there to worship that idol? No, I don't. I go there to have a meal. I have no intent on worshiping that idol, none whatsoever. I'm just there to eat a meal. That's all. That's all I'm there to do. So, can someone come to a church building on the first day of the week and have no intent on worshiping God? Yes, that is possible. That's very possible. Is that person acceptable to God and their worship acceptable to God? Well, they weren't there to worship. So they didn't worship, and the answer would be no. They were in the right place at the right time, but their heart wasn't there. Their heart was somewhere else. So let's talk about truth now, because Christ says something now about truth, that God is going to be worshiped in truth. Now, that's not saying God is going to be worshiped in subjectivity of you just decide how you're going to worship Him. That you just decide what are your ways of worshiping Him. And you just make it up as you go along. And God's going to be okay with that. Well, if that were the case, then it would be okay for the Samaritans to worship the way they were worshiping God then. But Christ actually says, you worship who you do not know. Which is the same thing that Paul says to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17. And Paul's not talking to Athenians in Acts chapter 17. Paul is talking to Athenians. He's not talking to Samaritans in Acts chapter 17. He's talking to pagans. These are worshipers of Athena and all these other things. And that they did not know who they were to worship. And that shrine to the unknown God, He's going to declare that God who they would want to worship, but they have no idea how He is to be worshiped. They don't know. It is not to build Him a shrine and just say to the unknown God. That's not the way He's worshiped. If God would allow for anything, then that would be allowed as well. But it's not. If God would allow for anything, then the way the Samaritans were doing it would be okay. And Christ wouldn't need to correct them at all. But now we go just looking at an example. Exodus chapter 17 and verse 6. God provides instruction to Moses. Moses is a prophet. Moses is the leader of Israel. Moses, as being a prophet and a leader of Israel, there's more expected out of him than your average Israelite. There's more expected out of him. And God is to be regarded as holy. And he is to do precisely as God asks him or tells him to do. Now this concerns water, is what this concerns. Because the people are murmuring again. Somehow they're being put to the test and they fail repeatedly. Now not everybody does. But, because I can't say that all of them, absolutely all of them were doing this, but most of them were. They are complaining against God, and there's the usual complaint of, why did you take us into the wilderness to kill us? Well, if God wanted you dead, He wouldn't have taken the trouble to take you out of Egypt to kill you. He would have killed you in Egypt. If He wanted you dead, you'd be dead. And if He were going to protect you, He would protect you. Well, has He been? Where were you at the Red Sea crossing? They witnessed it. Where were you when He is feeding by way of manna? Oh, you've witnessed that too. You think God can't supply? But here He tells, they're in the wilderness. This is a very arid place. Arid meaning little water. Okay? And so God says, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Okay, here's the instruction. You're going to go to a specific rock, not just any rock will do, a specific rock, and you're going to strike that rock. And then water will come out of the rock. Now, this is not instruction on how to get water no matter where you are, all right? Because you go striking rocks, the likelihood is you're not going to get water from that rock. This is not the how to get water out of nothing sort of instruction. This is a miracle that's only for this event. That's all it is. I'm sorry to say that's all it is. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. But it doesn't expand to whenever you want water, just go to a rock and strike it. That's not the instruction at all. And of course, Moses would have understood that. Now, we go from Exodus to Numbers, and some years have passed now. And we come to Numbers 20 and verse 8, and here are more instructions to Moses, and it's a very similar situation. Very similar. Now, God is actually going to put Moses to the test. Moses is not someone that God sets apart and says, I will never test him. Moses was tested all the time. So were the people. They were tested as well. But God, as we said, with detail, it matters. Take the rod. You and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals. I thought it was strike the rock. Well, in Exodus it was, but we're not in Exodus anymore. And once again, the instructions in Exodus are for a one-time event. Can God decide how He wants to do this? So why would God, or why did God change His instruction at two different times? Why did He change the instruction? Wouldn't He have wanted Moses to do the same thing? Well, obviously He didn't. A rock will not produce water by striking it or speaking to it unless God says it will. Or that's it. Unless God says that this is going to happen by a certain action, then that's what's going to happen. All right, to change those details are not good. To do something other than what He is told to do is not good. Now, as it turns out, Moses was Well, his patience was tried by the people. His patience was often tried by a hard-hearted people, a stubborn people. And you would think, he would think better of them, but then they would prove he's wrong. They would prove that you're thinking too well of them, is what you're doing. You're thinking far too well again, that they can blunder and blunder in an enormous sort of way. So, one, this is a test for Moses. This is not a test for anybody else. And Moses does fail this test, by the way. He strikes the rock. And it's because of that, striking the rock, that while God does not strike him dead, He's not going to do that, there will be a punishment for that, and that Moses will never enter into Canaan, the land promised. He will take them from Egypt up to the Jordan, but never cross it. He will never cross it. He's going to let him look into really Israel's future home. And it's not going to be too much longer, and they're going to have it. Israel's future home, and where the rest of Israel's history will be made right there, but he'll never be able to go into it. It is a test for Moses whether he will do this or not. There is also a greater demonstration of God's power in this. A greater demonstration, and it has more than one facet to it. One is it's by His authority that this is done. God can decide one way, that's going to be done this way this time, and then change up, it's going to be this way this time. He has the authority to do that. He can decide. And in all this, Israel will see the power of God in multiple ways. Not just striking the rock or hitting the rock, but now speaking to the rock. Israel will now see that there is more to this. That's a lesson that they should have already learned in this, but this is multifaceted, that the power of God is going to be seen in this. Also, it presents a lesson to pay attention to the details because they are important, and the lesson is not just for Moses. Now, it is for him, but it's also for Aaron and all those priests. It's going to be for them as well. It's going to be for Israel. It's for them as well. And now it comes to us that God is interested in the details, and that the details, while they may seem minor to us, they can't be minor to God, otherwise He would not have given them to us. He gave them for a specific reason. Now, we go to Leviticus chapter 10, and this concerns Nadab and Abihu. And here, Nadab and Abihu are killed on the spot. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it. So they're priests, all right? Put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. That's it. That's all. And Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified." So Aaron held his peace. I must be glorified before them all. God had a greater expectation out of these priests, a greater responsibility from them, because they are handling very important matters concerning worship to God. And we go back to all of this, that they offered profane fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. Didn't He command them that they had to put fire on the incense? How else are you going to burn the incense? Well, yeah, He did command them to put fire on the incense, just not the fire that they were using. Just not that one. Now, let's look at the things Nadab and Abihu got right. Are they sons of Aaron? Yes. Were they legitimately made priests by God? Yes. Legitimately. They held those positions, and they are in that first generation of priests, and their father Aaron is high priest. All right, so they got that right. Was incense, burning incense, a part of worship to God? Yes, they got that part right. Was it to be put into a censer? Because each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it. Okay, so is there anything wrong with the censers? No, they got that right. Thus far, things look extremely good. Just right down the line, this is what they're doing. Not just anybody could have done this. Moses could not have done this because Moses was not a son of Aaron. He's a brother of Aaron, but even then, he's not a priest. Never was a priest. A prophet, yes. Leader, yes. Never a priest. But they could do it. They could rightfully do it. But they take some other fire that he did not command them. Some other fire. And when they do this, this would be just in their own way of thinking, what does it really matter? To God, it mattered. Because when He sets aside one fire, He excludes any other. And there's nothing about the other fire that was, that it wouldn't burn the incense. It would burn the incense. There's nothing about that fire that would set it apart, except that God set one apart. This is the fire that is to be used. And when they didn't, what were they doing? They were saying that God was not holy and that they were not glorifying God before the people. They were not, because they were taking this entirely too casually. They were taking this without any kind of thought, without any of this. In my whole thing, if I had been a priest that had witnessed that, I think I said this not too long ago, I would make sure this is where the fear of God comes in. I would make sure that I write down everything that I must do as a priest. I'd write it all down and get it directly from what Moses has already written down. Not making up my own, not following somebody's tradition, not even relying on somebody else to get it right. I'm going to go to the text to find out what must we do. What must we do? Because that's the only way you're going to be able to survive this. Only way to please God. And is God cruel in doing this? No, He's not. He is sovereign. He is creator. He made us, and He will judge us. He sets the standard in everything. He sets the standard in everything. So, should we take a casual approach to worship? We better not. By no means. Worship, where I used to preach years ago, we would get a lot of tourists, and we get visitors. We get a lot of tourists. And you could tell how someone took worship seriously and others did not. You could tell. You could definitely tell when someone did not take worship seriously at all. You could definitely tell it. When someone, this was in Daytona, when someone came to worship dressed for the beach, and I'm not kidding you, dressed for the beach, this just coming to worship is just like a small formality, and then they're off to do what they're going to do. Just this inconvenience, and they're off to do what they're going to do. That's entirely what it was. Nothing else. Do we take worship by way of some casual, flippant approach? Well, we better not. We better not do that. Can worship to God be reinterpreted? Can we just reinvent it? And no, we can't. We can't do that either. Can we improve worship for God? No, we can't do that either. While, you have in the book of 1 Corinthians, in chapter 13 of Paul writing there, in verse 3, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Though I give my body to be burned. Now he's using hyperbole in all this. That means great exaggeration, going to an absurd point to prove a point that, while I could feel like if I gave my body to be a burned sacrifice, surely that would be extraordinarily pleasing to God. But He never asked us to do that. He didn't call us to do that. He called us to be a living sacrifice, Romans chapter 12. A living sacrifice where our life is being sacrificed, not that we're laying down to be burned as some kind of, on some literal altar, but that our behavior, our demeanor, everything about us glorifies God. Now, can we improve worship for Him? No. No, we cannot improve it. Is worshiping God unimportant? Is how we worship God unimportant? Is it secondary? Is it subjective? Is it due for modifications? Does it matter? Is God to be regarded as holy? Yes, He is. And we come to this note. What you truly worship will never be worshiped casually. What you truly worship, what anyone truly worships, will not be worshipped casually. Never. What does it mean to do something religiously? What does that mean? That means there is a devotion that is there. That means that someone will make the sacrifices that it takes, if it's money, if it's time, whatever it is. They will do it for what they truly are acting religious toward. To do something religiously means that nothing else gets in the way of this. It reminds me, is before Hurricane Andrew. It's a long time ago for some of you. It was a long time for me too. But Hurricane Andrew, and they were interviewing people in the Miami area. Are you getting out? Because this looks bad, and it was bad. Hurricane Andrew is coming. Are you getting out? And they talked to some young fella on the beach. Are you leaving? He said, and he was holding a surfboard. Are you leaving? He said, no, I'm not leaving. He said, why aren't you leaving? He said, because I'm dedicated. It's dedicated to surfing? That you're going to surf that? You have no sense of reality, of proportion. This thing is death. This thing coming here, it will blow down trees. You think it can't do something to you? It will bring in a surge that will move ships from offshore inshore, right on in. It's going to do this. And you think that somehow it's okay for you to stay here? But that just proves the point. Now, I have no idea what happened to him. He probably left anyway. But that's the whole viewpoint in this, is that someone who does something religiously will be dedicated to it, truly being dedicated to it. Now, we come to 1 Corinthians 11, we begin in verse 17, and this is the Holy Spirit giving instructions to the church at Corinth. Now, Paul is the chosen writer, but it's the Holy Spirit giving this because while they should have known, and they did know, the church at Corinth was failing in many, many ways. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. And this is a harsh judgment, but it's the truth. What the Holy Spirit is saying is that it would have been better if you had never come here at all. Now, he's talking about worship because they were not worshiping properly. They would have been better off to have stayed home because they're not coming together for the betterment. They're coming together and they are becoming worse. They were better off prior to their idea of worship than what occurred during worship. For first of all, when you come together as a church, so that's what this is about. I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. This is complete abuse of the Lord's Supper. This is not what the Lord's Supper is about at all. This is worldliness, extreme actually, coming in place. And Corinth was, as are many cities, it's got its sins. Corinth had numerous sins imported right in because it's a coastal city. These things are imported in from various countries, but it's going into the church now. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." Now, we come to this, verse 27. "Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord." Is that not a serious offense? Yeah, it is. That is a serious offense. That goes right back to what God said concerning Nadab and Abihu, that whoever approaches me, he must be regarded as holy. He must be, and his commands must be regarded as holy. Must be. Now, what would it be in an unworthy manner? Well, what they've been doing is an unworthy manner. How they had been going about the Lord's Supper was completely an unworthy manner. But this is in remembrance of Christ. And it is the most important event in human, or in any history. Any history. From eternity to eternity. This is the most important event ever. This is a far greater event than the creation of the world, because it's the salvation of all mankind. It's far greater than the flood. It's far greater than anything we might imagine. This is the greatest event ever, the greatest show of love, and you cannot be shown a greater love than what Christ did for all of us. There is no greater love than this, that the Son of God died for us. What's greater than that? Nothing. Nothing is greater than that. That your Creator, my Creator, died for us. What's greater than that? Nothing is greater than that. And we are to remember Him. It is a memorial. That means to remember what He did for us. Are there details that have to be kept? Yes. What it consists of, what they represent, the fact that we are to have the proper mindset in this. God judges all that because God knows. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. That means they are spiritually dead. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. There are more things that need to be set in order. Now, we come to Ephesians 5:19. Is this not details? Just like with the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper doesn't come without details. This comes with details too. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. This comes with detail. And actually in economy of words, in just a very few words, we see the who, we see the what, we see the why, we see the how. This is all, and in the context we see the when. But in this, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, this is what's to be done. Something, and making melody in your heart, obviously, this is lyrics with a tune of some sort. But the lyrics are going to have to be something that resembles a psalm, a hymn, or a spiritual song. It's got to be in one of those categories. And otherwise, not just any song is appropriate. Not just any song can be used for worship. But it's these categories: psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. Then singing. Now, pairing up singing and speaking, what does that mean? That means something must be enunciated. Something must be in the words. There must be words. There must be words that are spoken, that are sung, and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Singing and making melody, and with all these verbs, the verbs in the original Greek is everyone is involved in this. Everyone takes part in worship. Everyone is to do that. It's not for just the best singers to impress the rest of us, to perform for the rest of us. It's all of us singing to God. And God made you to worship Him and to serve Him. And why can't He do that? He made you. He knows what you're capable of doing and what you're incapable of doing. And all of this is judged by the spirit of it and the truth of it, not by the skill of it, or the talent of it, but the spirit and the truth of it. Following the truth in all of this. All of this must be done. Now, we switch over to Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. So it's saying similar things. Actually, it's saying the same thing, just from a different approach. That in the words there must be some kind of teaching or some kind of admonition that's involved in it. There must be something involved in it. It's not that the words are fuzzy, or the words are meaningless, or the words neither teach nor admonish. Something must be there, and it has to be based off of Scripture. It has to be. Now, teaching and admonishing in a psalm or a hymn or a spiritual song, inside that song is false doctrine. Well, that's no good. That's no good. And yeah, I've been at certain places where the hymns that they sang, if the preacher went up and preached what that hymn taught, they would fire him pretty quick. But they'll all sing it. It's a hypocrisy that's there. And it's just some not realizing, some not putting two and two together, that yes, there must be a solid teaching and a solid admonition that is done by all, by the psalms, hymns, by the spiritual songs being sung. And when God specifies something, everything else is excluded. When He specifies something, everything else is gone. It's not allowed. Is this subjective? Is this due to modification? Does this matter? Should traditions or popular beliefs overrule or outrank this? No. Just because millions of people might believe something doesn't mean it's true. Or do something doesn't mean it ought to be done. Or somehow that God, seeing that a great number of people are doing something a certain way, that He's going to turn a blind eye to it and say, well, that's okay because there's so many doing it. There's nothing I can... I mean, it's all with the good intent, I suppose. We'll just let them do it. Well, I can learn from Scripture that God does not do that and teaches specifically against it. And in more than one place. We learn concerning Nadab and Abihu, but it's more than just with them. It's more than just one place. And we come back to this. What you truly worship will never be worshiped casually. Meaning, if you see worship to God as something you can do casually, your heart's not in the right place. It's that simple. That can be adjusted, and adjusted by you, to see something out of place and making the proper changes. Because you can't worship God in an apathetic way. You cannot worship God in a unconcerned way, but always faithfully. That's what He requires out of all of us. And if God put in the detail and commands the detail, what are we supposed to do? Follow those details. And there's not a single detail that's impossible for us to do. Not a single detail. Just like with Naaman, who was a leper, what he's told to do to be rid of leprosy was something that he could do, that he could easily do. God does not ask us to do something that's impossible. He does not ask us to do something that we couldn't possibly accomplish, but things, in fact, that we can do simply. And quite often, it's all interior. It's all what we want to do. That's it. We need to look at our lives. We need to look at our heart. We need to look at our priorities and make the proper changes. Because God is not worshiped with no truth or a little bit of the truth. He's worshiped by the truth being done. But someone who follows God to faithfully in those ways also has to have the right attitude. Have to have the right attitude. And that is the Spirit and truth. Having the Spirit that is there, a desire to worship Him, and a willingness and truly a dedication to worship Him in truth. We look at this. Our days on this earth have a number to them. We don't know that number. We're never given that number. Our days on this earth are going by day. And we have this opportunity, we have now to make the adjustments we need to make. We have now to turn as we should. And with these things, it's a matter of setting the heart right. We ask this morning, if you need to obey the gospel, that you come as we stand and sing.